I got home after a 12-hour shift and realized my own key no longer worked. Then my younger brother yelled through the front door, "You may pay for this house, but nobody here actually respects you anyway." That was the exact moment I started wondering if I'd destroyed my own life trying to save my family. I'm 29, and for the last 5 years I've worked construction in Arizona installing solar panels. If you've never spent an entire summer on rooftops in Phoenix heat, imagine standing inside an oven while carrying metal equipment up ladders all day. That's basically my life. The money got better over time though. I started out making around $18 an hour, just another exhausted guy dragging panels across rooftops. Most people quit within months. Some showed up high, some disappeared halfway through projects, some couldn't survive the heat. I stayed. I worked weekends, took extra shifts, learned everything I could, and eventually got promoted to crew supervisor. Now I make around $75,000 a year managing commercial and residential installs across the valley. It sounds decent until you realize I've basically been financing 3 other adults the entire time. My best friend Marcus has been warning me for years that my family was using me. Marcus owns an auto repair shop outside Tempe. Huge guy. Looks intimidating as hell, but he's one of the few people who's ever been completely honest with me. One night over beers he looked at me and said, "Bro, this isn't helping family anymore. You're basically sponsoring people who don't respect you." I laughed it off at the time. I shouldn't have. Even my cat seems smarter than me. I've got this fat orange tabby named Biscuit who absolutely hates strangers but somehow especially hated my brother. Every time my brother came around, Biscuit would sit in the hallway staring at him like he was witnessing a crime in progress. Honestly, maybe he was. This whole mess started back in 2019 when my parents almost lost their house. My dad had gotten laid off, my mom was barely working part-time, and they were already months behind on payments. I still remember sitting at their kitchen table looking at foreclosure paperwork spread everywhere while my mom cried. They needed a little over $4,000 immediately or the bank was taking the house. At the time I'd just gotten promoted at work. For the first time in my life I actually had savings. Not rich people money but enough to finally feel stable. Instead of loaning them money they'd never repay, I made what I thought was the responsible decision. I bought the house myself. Used almost everything I had saved. Drained my emergency account. Cashed out part of my retirement early and got hammered with penalties. Took out a personal loan to cover the rest. The house went entirely into my name. I figured it protected everybody. They'd keep living there, make affordable payments to me over time, and eventually we'd all recover financially. At least that's what I told myself. The place itself wasn't fancy. Just a basic 3-bedroom ranch house in a quiet Phoenix suburb. Built sometime in the 90s. Decent schools nearby. Safe neighborhood. Property values kept rising every year, which made me feel like maybe I'd made a smart investment. The crazy part? Their old mortgage payment was only around $850 a month. 2 adults should have been able to handle that easily. But my parents have always been terrible with money. My dad buys random junk whenever he's stressed, and my mom acts like credit cards are free money from heaven. Over the next 4 years they never paid me back. Not once. Meanwhile, every problem with the house somehow became my responsibility because legally, it was mine. New roof after a hailstorm? $12,000. Air conditioner died during a July heat wave? Another $8,000. Plumbing backed up because of tree roots? More money. Garage door broke. Exterior paint faded. Water heater leaked. Every single call started the same way. "Hey, we've got a problem at the house." And every single time I paid for it. I kept spreadsheets tracking every expense because part of me honestly believed they'd eventually try to claim I was exaggerating. The worst part wasn't even the money. It was watching my own life stall out while theirs stayed comfortable. I postponed buying my own place. Put off replacing my truck even though the transmission sounded terrible. Stopped taking vacations completely. Meanwhile, my parents were basically living rent-free in a house I was fully supporting. And somehow, I was still the selfish one anytime I brought it up. My parents are both 52, and somehow they've spent the last several years acting like they're the victims in every situation imaginable. My dad, Ron, swears his back injury makes him physically incapable of holding a normal job anymore. According to him, standing for too long is unbearable. Lifting things is dangerous. Any kind of schedule causes stress flare-ups. But somehow he spends entire days in my garage rebuilding a classic Mustang. No joke. 12 hours at a time. Bent over engines. Hauling tools around. Crawling under the car like a guy auditioning for a mechanic commercial. Meanwhile my mom, Denise, works maybe 3 days a week at this little salon in town. She acts like she's carrying the entire economy on her shoulders because she spent 6 hours listening to clients complain about their husbands. Most nights she came home exhausted from dealing with people, poured wine into a coffee mug and started online shopping with my credit card saved on Amazon. Then there's my younger brother, Dylan. Dylan is 24 and somehow both deeply confident and completely unemployable. He started college, dropped out almost immediately, switched programs twice, tried trade school for a while, then quit that too because the instructors didn't understand his creativity. Since then he's burned through more jobs than I can remember. Electronic stores, restaurants, customer service, delivery driving, temp work. Nothing ever lasted. Now he calls himself a freelance designer, which mostly means sitting in sweatpants making terrible album covers for his friends' SoundCloud pages while talking about building a personal brand. I know that sounds harsh, but living with him for years destroyed whatever patience I had left. He'd eat food I paid for, disappear with my tools, use my streaming accounts, then somehow still act like I was exploiting him. And the way they talked about me to other people honestly messed with my head. Dylan would bring friends over and act like the house belonged to him. "This place is basically my setup," he'd say while showing people around. Meanwhile I was the punchline. "Oh, don't mind my brother," he'd joke. "He thinks paying bills makes him king of the house." Everybody would laugh. My dad loved complaining that I micromanaged repairs whenever I asked why something I paid for got destroyed again. My mom constantly redecorated the place with money that wasn't hers, then got offended if I questioned it. At one point she seriously wanted a full kitchen remodel that would have cost close to 15 grand. When I told her I literally couldn't afford it, she looked at me like I'd embarrassed her on purpose. "You make good money," she said. "Why are you acting broke?" Because I was broke. Because I was supporting 3 adults who treated me like an ATM with feelings. But everything finally exploded on New Year's Eve. I still think about that night more than I should. December 31st, 2023. Arizona was getting hit with this weird cold front, and temperatures had dropped lower than usual. I'd just gotten off work and stopped to buy groceries, drinks, steaks, snacks. Basically everything for the New Year's party my family had been planning for weeks. I spent hundreds of dollars. I remember standing at the front door juggling grocery bags while trying to unlock it. Before I could, my mom opened the door halfway. And immediately her entire face changed when she saw me. Not angry. Not surprised. Cold. Like I was some stranger interrupting her evening. "You've got the wrong house," she said. At first I honestly laughed because I thought she was joking. "Mom, what?" "I don't know you," she replied flatly. Then she started closing the door. I just stood there confused, still holding grocery bags. "Are you serious? I bought all the food for tonight." "We don't need favors from you," she snapped. Then she slammed the door in my face. Art. I wish I could say I immediately got angry, but honestly, at first I just felt embarrassed. I stood outside for probably 10 minutes while music blasted inside. People were laughing. I could smell food cooking in the backyard. My own family was having a party in my house while pretending I didn't exist. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Dylan. "Don't make this weird, dude. Mom said you weren't invited this year. We're trying to keep things positive." The second text came right after. "Maybe hang out with people your own age for once." That should have been enough. I should have left right then. But then I heard my dad through the front window. Clear as day. Maybe now he'll understand that paying bills doesn't make him the head of the family. Someone laughed. Then Dylan said, "Honestly, it's pathetic. He keeps throwing money at us hoping we'll love him for it." And my mom answered, "He's gotten way too involved in our lives." That one hit the hardest. Because suddenly everything became painfully obvious. I was standing outside in the cold holding bags of food for people who had spent years resenting me while depending on me completely. And for the first time since buying that house, I stopped seeing myself as their son or brother. I saw myself as the idiot financing people who openly despised me. That was the part that finally broke me. Not the money. Not the stress. Not even getting locked out of my own house. It was realizing they didn't appreciate anything I'd done. They hated me for it. 4 years of covering their bills, repairs, taxes, insurance, and somehow I'd become the villain in their story. They'd rather pretend I didn't exist than admit I'd saved them. I sat in my truck for a while gripping the steering wheel, seriously considering driving back to my apartment and spending New Year's Eve alone. Then I remembered my friend Marcus had invited me over earlier that week. So I called him. The second he answered, he could tell something was wrong. "Dude, where are you?" I told him everything in about 30 seconds. Silence. Then, "Are you kidding me right now? Get over here immediately." Marcus lived about 20 minutes away in one of those neighborhoods where everybody actually knows each other. Christmas lights still hanging everywhere. People standing outside talking. Kids running around with sparklers. Completely different from the tension at my parents' place. I showed up still carrying grocery bags like an idiot, and before I could even explain anything, Marcus's mom pulled me into a hug. "Oh honey," she said. "Jay told us what happened. His mom, Teresa, has basically treated me like family since high school. Tiny woman. Loud voice. Constantly cooking enough food to feed 50 people. The second she saw the bags in my hands, she looked offended. Why are you bringing food? Put that down. You're a guest." I almost laughed hearing someone call me a guest after what had just happened. Marcus handed me a beer before I even sat down. "So let me get this straight," he said. "You paid for their party, then they locked you out of the house you own?" "Pretty much." He stared at me for a second, then burst out laughing. Not cruel laughter. More like complete disbelief. "Bro, this sounds like one of those reality shows where the main character doesn't realize everyone's been messing with him for years." Honestly, that's exactly how it felt. His dad, Frank, overheard the conversation while grilling steaks outside. Frank worked construction his entire life before retiring. Big rough hands, permanently sunburned neck, the kind of guy who respects people who work hard. When Marcus explained the situation, Frank just shook his head slowly. "Son," he said, "if somebody saved my house from foreclosure, I'd spend the rest of my life thanking them." That hit harder than I expected. Because nobody in my actual family had ever thanked me once. Not sincerely. Marcus's sister Elena joined the conversation next. She works as a real estate paralegal, so the second she heard I legally owned the property, she became weirdly fascinated. "Wait," she said, sitting forward. "The deed is fully in your name?" "Yeah." "And there's no lease agreement?" "No." "They've never paid rent consistently?" I shook my head. Elena blinked a couple times like she was mentally processing how insane this was. "Theo, you realize they have basically zero claim to that house, right?" Marcus nearly choked on his drink. "Oh my God," he said. "Please tell me you're finally considering kicking them out." I didn't answer right away. Because until that night, even after everything, I still felt guilty for thinking it. That's the messed up part. I was more worried about hurting people who openly humiliated me than they were about hurting me. Meanwhile, I'm sitting in this warm house surrounded by people who weren't even biologically related to me, and somehow they treated me with more kindness in 1 hour than my family had in years. Around midnight, everybody gathered in the living room counting down to the new year. Marcus raised his champagne glass, the same bottle I'd originally bought for my family's party, and looked directly at me. "To Theo," he said, "who's finally learning the difference between real family and people who just share your last name." Everybody cheered. And for some reason that almost made me emotional. Because deep down I knew he was right. Later that night, after the countdown and fireworks and all the noise died down, Marcus pulled me aside. "You know what you have to do now, right?" I already knew the answer before he said it. "They think it's their house," he continued. "You need to remind them whose name is actually on that deed." Something shifted in me right then. Like a switch finally flipping after years of denial. For the first time, I stopped thinking like a son trying to keep the peace. And started thinking like the owner of a house full of people who clearly didn't respect him. The next morning, January 1st, 2024, I sat in my apartment drinking coffee and researching eviction laws with more focus than I'd had in years. My apartment was honestly depressing compared to the house I was paying for. 1 bedroom. Cheap carpet. Tiny kitchen. $900 a month so I could live 20 minutes away from the property I actually owned. That realization started eating at me after New Year's. I sat at my little kitchen table with my laptop open, reading Arizona eviction laws while Biscuit watched from the counter like some furry little attorney judging my life choices. I swear that cat knew exactly what was happening. For years he'd hiss anytime my brother came near him. Now he just sat there calmly watching me scroll through legal websites like he'd been waiting for this moment. I looked at him and said, "What do you think? Time to stop being a doormat?" Biscuit slowly blinked at me, knocked my pen off the table, then stretched out like he finally approved of my decisions for once. Around noon Marcus showed up carrying breakfast sandwiches and coffee. The second he walked in he asked, "So, did you cool down overnight or are we still going with the scorched earth approach?" I took a bite of food before answering. "No," I said. "I'm done protecting people who hate me." And honestly, saying it out loud felt weirdly freeing. I spent the entire morning researching tenant laws. Turns out when someone lives in your property without a formal lease agreement, things get legally messy, but not in the way my family would have hoped. They were basically month-to-month occupants with very limited protections. Meaning if I followed proper procedure, I could legally remove them. That realization changed everything. Up until then, part of me still felt trapped. Like because they were family, I somehow had no choice. But legally? I absolutely did. That's when I contacted a lawyer named Vanessa Carter. I found her through landlord forums and online reviews, and every description of her sounded mildly terrifying. Efficient. Aggressive. Doesn't lose eviction cases. Her office looked exactly how you'd imagine a high-powered attorney's office would look. Dark wood shelves. Framed degrees everywhere. The kind of place designed to make nervous people sweat. Vanessa herself wasn't physically intimidating at all. Maybe 5'3". Perfect posture. Calm voice. But the second she started asking questions, I understood why people hired her. So let me confirm this, she said, flipping through my paperwork. You purchased the property yourself. The deed is entirely under your name. They've lived there for years without paying consistent rent. And they believe the house still belongs to them. Basically, yeah. A tiny smile crossed her face. Well, she said, this is unusually straightforward. Marcus almost looked disappointed. That's it? He asked. No legal loopholes? No surprise twist. Vanessa laughed softly. The only surprising part is how long he tolerated this. Then she looked directly at me. You understand they're going to react emotionally once reality hits them. That sentence stuck with me. Because deep down I knew she was right. People who spend years taking advantage of you rarely admit it gracefully. I showed her everything. Tax records. Repair invoices. Insurance payments. Utility bills. Bank statements. I'd kept documentation for years almost out of paranoia. Now it was saving me. Vanessa reviewed everything for nearly an hour before finally leaning back in her chair. In 15 years, she said, I've rarely seen a cleaner ownership case. Hearing that made my stomach twist. Not because I felt guilty. Because it confirmed I'd been right all along. 2 days later, the paperwork was ready. Official notices demanding they either vacate the property within 30 days or begin paying rent legally. Vanessa suggested including a rental option because it made me appear reasonable if things escalated to court. The proposed rent? $1,000 monthly. Still below market value. But we both knew there was almost zero chance they'd pay it consistently. They'll either refuse, Vanessa explained, or agree and immediately default. Either way you gain leverage. Marcus read the paperwork while sitting at my kitchen counter. Then he started grinning. Oh, this is beautiful, he said. This is the find out stage. I wish I could say I felt powerful. Honestly, I mostly felt numb. January 3rd. That's the day everything became real. I drove to the house with the legal paperwork and a professional process server Vanessa hired. Marcus insisted on tagging along. No chance I'm missing this, he said. I've watched this train wreck for years. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach started twisting immediately. Because despite everything, some part of me still expected this to magically resolve peacefully. It didn't. My dad answered the door wearing sweatpants and an old robe, looking annoyed before he even realized I wasn't alone. Then he noticed the guy in the suit beside me. His entire expression changed. Theo, he said slowly. What's going on? The process server stepped forward without emotion. Richard Hale, he said professionally, you are being formally served regarding this property. The process server handed my dad the documents and calmly said, you've officially been served. Then he turned around and walked back to his car like this was just another Tuesday. Meanwhile, my entire family looked like the floor had disappeared underneath them. My dad kept staring down at the paperwork without blinking. What the hell is this? He asked finally. Theo, what did you do? Read it carefully. My mom rushed over and snatched the papers out of his hands. The second she saw the words notice to vacate, her voice jumped an entire octave. This has to be fake, she snapped. We own this house. That's when my brother Dylan appeared behind them, already angry before he even understood what was happening. This is seriously pathetic, he said, glaring at me. You can't just invent legal papers because you're pissed off. I honestly expected denial. I just didn't expect it to happen this fast. Look up the property records, I said. The deed's been under my name for 4 years. Silence. For maybe 2 seconds. Then Dylan exploded. You're lying. I'm not. This is our house. No, I said calmly. It's mine. That sentence hit them harder than the paperwork did. You could actually see the moment it started sinking in. Not emotionally. Legally. Their expressions changed from outrage to confusion, then panic. Dylan immediately switched back to aggression because apparently that's the only emotion he knows how to process. "We're not leaving," he snapped. "You want us out? Then come force us out." Marcus finally stepped forward beside me. And considering he's built like a refrigerator with tattoos, the energy shifted immediately. "That's probably not the smartest thing to say to the legal owner of the property," he said. Dylan shut up after that. But instead of taking the situation seriously, they convinced themselves I was bluffing. Apparently Dylan spent the next several hours telling my parents the documents were fake, that I'd somehow forged ownership paperwork, and that a judge would laugh me out of court. Which honestly would have been funny if it wasn't so insane. Then the family phone call started. My aunt called crying about how I was throwing my parents into the street. A cousin texted me paragraphs about loyalty and respect. One uncle left a voicemail saying he was disappointed in the kind of man I'd become. And the craziest part? Almost none of them asked what actually happened. They just accepted my mom's version immediately. According to her, I was trying to steal the house through legal manipulation because I'd become bitter and controlling. Apparently I was having some kind of emotional breakdown after New Year's Eve. That part almost made me laugh. Because they conveniently skipped over why I snapped in the first place. Then my uncle David called. And everything changed. David is my dad's older brother. Owns a plumbing company. Worked his entire life. Raised 4 kids after losing his wife years ago. He's also the only person in the family who's never tolerated my dad's excuses. Growing up, family gatherings usually ended with David calling my father lazy while everyone else tried to calm things down. So when I answered his call, I honestly expected another lecture. Instead he said, "All right, tell me what actually happened." So I did. Everything. The foreclosure. Buying the house. Paying every expense. The years of disrespect. The New Year's incident. He listened quietly the entire time. Which is unusual for him. When I finished there was this long pause. Then suddenly he started laughing. Not polite laughter either. Full-on laughing. "You're telling me," he said between breaths, "that your father has spent 4 years complaining about being controlled, while living for free in a house his own son owns?" "Pretty much." "Oh my God," he said. "That's the funniest thing I've heard in years." Honestly, hearing someone finally acknowledge how ridiculous the situation was felt weirdly emotional. After hours of relatives treating me like a monster, I genuinely needed someone sane to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. "So you don't think I'm overreacting?" I asked. "Overreacting?" he repeated. "Theo, you should have done this years ago." Then he got serious. "Your dad's been running from responsibility his entire life. Every time someone bails him out, he learns absolutely nothing. And apparently there was a lot I didn't even know." David started telling me stories about my father borrowing money from relatives decades ago and never repaying them. Failed business ideas. Jobs he quit after arguments. Constant excuses whenever life got difficult. "You saving that house was the best thing that ever happened to him," David said. And instead of appreciating it, he got comfortable. That word stuck with me. Comfortable. Because that's exactly what happened. They got so comfortable living off my sacrifice that eventually they stopped seeing me as a person entirely. I was just the resource keeping their lifestyle alive. A few days after they were served, I got a call from Vanessa. I figured she was calling to discuss move-out logistics. Instead, the first thing she said was, "You're not going to believe this. That's never a good sign." "What happened?" "They hired an attorney." I actually laughed. "Seriously?" "Very seriously. And they're contesting everything." Apparently my parents and Dylan had convinced themselves they could somehow fight the eviction. Their attorney's argument basically came down to this. They had lived there for years. Therefore they deserved the house. Even saying it out loud sounded ridiculous. Vanessa sounded almost amused. "Their lawyer is throwing every argument he can think of at the wall and hoping something sticks." "What are our chances?" "The same as yesterday," she replied. "Excellent." Still, the upcoming hearing made me nervous. No matter how strong your case is, walking into a courtroom is intimidating. January 25th finally arrived. I showed up early wearing the nicest suit I owned. Vanessa met me outside carrying several folders that contained years of records. Property documents. Tax records. Insurance statements. Repair invoices. Bank transfers. Everything. Every sacrifice I'd made for that house was sitting inside those folders. Meanwhile, my family arrived with their lawyer. My dad looked exhausted. My mom looked angry. Dylan looked weirdly confident, like he genuinely believed this was going to end with him exposing some massive conspiracy. I honestly couldn't understand it. The facts were public. The ownership records were public. The paperwork was public. Yet somehow they still believed reality would bend in their favor. When the hearing started, the judge immediately began asking questions. Vanessa presented our side first. Clear. Simple. Documented. The property was legally mine. The deed had been mine for years. Every major expense had been paid by me. Every tax bill had been paid by me. Every insurance payment had been paid by me. Nothing complicated. Just facts. Then the other side presented their argument. And honestly, it was painful to watch. Their lawyer talked about how long they'd lived in the house. How attached they were. How much effort they'd put into maintaining it. How unfair it would be for them to lose their home. The problem was that none of that actually addressed ownership. At one point the judge asked for documentation supporting their claims. There wasn't much. A few receipts. Some photographs. A lot of emotional arguments. Very little evidence. I watched Vanessa taking notes without even looking worried. That's when I realized how one-sided this had become. For years my family had operated on feelings. I had records. And records usually win. The judge eventually leaned back in her chair and started summarizing the facts. The property belonged to me. The ownership documents were valid. The occupancy arrangement did not transfer ownership. The defendants had no legal basis to claim the property. Every sentence felt like another door closing. Then came the final ruling. Their challenge was denied. They would have to leave. Simple as that. No dramatic speeches. No shocking twist. Just reality. The second the decision was announced, Dylan completely lost his composure. "This is insane," he shouted. Several heads turned immediately. The judge didn't look impressed. Court security moved closer. And suddenly the guy who'd spent years acting untouchable looked very small. Outside the courtroom he kept ranting about corruption, betrayal, and unfair treatment. Nobody listened. Because for the first time, there was nowhere left to hide from the truth. The truth was sitting in public records. The truth was sitting in court documents. The truth had just been confirmed by a judge. That night my Uncle David called. The second I answered, I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "Heard you won." "Yeah." "Well, it sounds like reality finally caught up with your father." I laughed. "Pretty much." Then he said something that stuck with me. "You know, Theo, helping somebody is supposed to make them stronger. Not comfortable." That one hit hard. Because comfort was exactly what I'd been financing for years. Not recovery. Not growth. Comfort. The next week was noticeably different. The confidence was gone. The threats were gone. The arrogance was gone. For the first time since this whole thing started, my family seemed to understand they were actually out of options. And then, on February 1st, my phone rang. It was my mom. The moment I heard her voice, I knew something had changed. Gone was the anger. Gone was the superiority. She sounded scared. "Theo," she said quietly, "we've been looking for places and—" My mom sounded completely different on that phone call. Not angry. Not demanding. Desperate. "Theo, we've been looking everywhere," she said. "Anything decent costs way more than we can afford. Every place wants deposits, application fees, first month's rent. We just don't have that kind of money right now." I put the call on speaker. Marcus was sitting across from me helping organize paperwork and immediately raised an eyebrow. Biscuit jumped onto the couch and settled beside him like he knew something interesting was happening. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then my mom finally asked the question she'd clearly been building toward. "Would you consider letting us stay as renters?" The irony almost made me laugh. 4 years of free housing. A foreclosure rescue. Being locked out on New Year's Eve. Getting dragged into court by my own family. And now they wanted permission to become tenants. Marcus nearly choked trying not to laugh. I kept my voice calm. "I already gave you an option. We're serious this time," she said quickly. "We'll pay. We just need a chance." Maybe I was being stubborn. Maybe I was still angry. Probably both. But I wasn't interested in another emotional arrangement. So I treated it like a business conversation. $1,000 a month, I said. Month-to-month lease. First payment due February 10th. Silence. Then my mom exhaled sharply. "That's a lot of money." "It's below market rate. Couldn't we start lower and work our way up?" I almost laughed. For years I'd paid every major expense on that property. Now suddenly they wanted to negotiate. "No," I said. "Comparable homes rent for much more than that. I'm already giving you a break." A few seconds later my dad got on the line. His tone immediately shifted into the familiar voice he always used when he wanted something. "Son, we can make this work." There it was. Not an apology. Not accountability. Just an attempt to smooth things over. The court situation got out of hand, he continued. I leaned back in my chair. No, I said. The court situation happened because you challenged reality. Silence. Then I added, this isn't a family arrangement anymore. It's a rental agreement. That sentence landed hard. Because for the first time the relationship had clear rules. No guilt. No manipulation. No pretending. Just obligations. Of course Dylan eventually grabbed the phone. Bro, come on. We just spent a bunch of money fighting this thing. I stared at the ceiling. You spent money trying to take my house. That's not how I see it. I know. More silence. Then I repeated the same number. $1,000. No discussion. No bargaining. No discounts. Take it or leave it. After I hung up, Marcus just sat there staring at me. You know they're not making that first payment, right? I wanted to disagree. I really did. Part of me still wanted to believe they'd finally learned something. But another part of me knew exactly how this story usually ended. Biscuit stretched across the couch and knocked a pen onto the floor. Marcus pointed at him. Even the cat thinks I'm right. A few days later, word spread through the family. Apparently every relative in the state now knew my parents were becoming tenants in the house they once thought they owned. My Uncle David called that evening. I heard you're giving them another chance. Yeah. You're a better man than me. I laughed. You don't think they'll pay? Theo, he said, your father hasn't managed his finances responsibly in decades. Fair point. Then he added. And your brother treats employment like a hobby. Also fair. The lease signing happened on February 8th. Vanessa handled everything. The atmosphere was awkward from the moment everyone sat down. My dad looked annoyed. My mom looked embarrassed. Dylan looked angry. Basically the usual. Every clause became an argument. Every paragraph became a complaint. Every responsibility became unfair somehow. Dylan was especially difficult. So if rent is late, you can just remove us? Vanessa didn't even look up from the paperwork. If the lease is violated, there are consequences. That seems extreme. It's called renting. I actually had to look away so I wouldn't smile. Eventually everyone signed. The lease became official. For the first time in years, there was finally a clear agreement in writing. As we were leaving, Vanessa quietly pulled me aside. Keep all your records. Why? She smiled. Experience. That answer didn't make me feel great. Then February 10th arrived. No payment. I checked twice. Nothing. February 11th. Still nothing. February 12th. My phone rang. Mom. Of course. Theo, she began carefully, we're having a little trouble pulling everything together. Marcus happened to be at my apartment that night eating pizza. The second he heard her voice, he started grinning. Biscuit was sprawled across my lap, purring loudly while I listened. Dad's disability paperwork is still pending, she continued. And Dylan hasn't been paid for one of his projects yet. I already knew where this was going. We should have the money soon. I closed my eyes. Because somehow, after everything that had happened, we were right back where we started. Cash flow issue, Marcus repeated after I hung up. Then he rolled his eyes. That's a really creative way of saying, we spent all our money fighting the guy who owns our house. I tried not to laugh. Part of me still felt guilty. Which sounds ridiculous considering everything that had happened. But these were still my parents. Even after the lies. Even after the court battle. Even after New Year's Eve. Some part of me kept hoping they'd finally take responsibility. Instead, the excuses continued. Every few days there was a new explanation. A delayed payment. A missing paycheck. A temporary setback. A misunderstanding. The story changed constantly. The result never did. No rent. By February 15th, not a single dollar had arrived. Then my dad called. And somehow he still sounded annoyed with me. Theo, we need to talk about this rent situation. I already knew where this was heading. What about it? $8,000 isn't realistic right now. Marcus, who happened to be sitting across from me, nearly spit out his drink. I muted the phone for a second. Did he really just say that? Marcus nodded. The man signed the lease himself. I unmuted. Dad, you agreed to the amount. Circumstances changed. No, I said. Your circumstances existed before you signed. Silence. Then came the line I should have expected. We're family. For years that phrase worked on me. It was the universal excuse. The emergency override button. The thing everybody said whenever they wanted something. This time it did nothing. You stopped treating me like family a long time ago, I replied. You're acting cold. You're acting like a tenant who hasn't paid rent. That ended the conversation quickly. 20 days after the lease started, there was still no payment. No partial payment. No payment plan. Nothing. Vanessa filed another eviction. And honestly, this one felt almost automatic. The first case had at least involved arguments about ownership. This time there was a signed lease, a due date, and a complete failure to pay. Even Vanessa seemed unsurprised. This is actually simpler than the first case, she told me. How? They agreed to the terms and immediately violated them. Fair enough. The hearing took place on March 1st. And the judge looked exhausted the second she saw everyone walk into the courtroom. Especially my family. Apparently repeatedly losing legal battles does not improve a judge's mood. Vanessa presented the lease, the payment history, the missed deadlines, the notices. Everything was straightforward. Then Dylan opened his mouth, which as usual made things worse. Your Honor, this is retaliation. The judge looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, retaliation for what? Dylan hesitated. For the previous case. The judge's expression didn't change. You mean the case where you unsuccessfully challenged ownership of property that wasn't yours? Silence. Then you signed a lease? More silence. And failed to pay rent? Even more silence. The judge shook her head. That's not retaliation. That's a consequence. Honestly, hearing someone else finally say it out loud felt strangely satisfying. A few minutes later the ruling came down. Eviction granted. 7 days. Not 30. 7. The judge clearly wanted the situation over with. And just like that it was done. Or at least I thought it was. Because the real chaos started afterward. A couple of weeks after they moved out, I was relaxing at my apartment when somebody started pounding on my door. Not knocking. Pounding. The kind of knock that immediately makes your stomach tighten. I opened it and found a huge guy standing there. Broad shoulders. Tattoos. Looked like he could bench press my car. And he was angry. Are you Theo? Yeah. The man looked past me into the apartment. I'm looking for your brother. That got my attention immediately. What happened? The guy introduced himself as Darren. Apparently he'd loaned Dylan several $1,000s. The amount made my stomach drop. 5,000. Wait, I said. You loaned Dylan $5,000? Yeah. Darren looked genuinely confused by my reaction. He said he owned a successful design business. Of course he did. He showed me pictures of the property, Darren continued. Nice house. Nice garage. Nice neighborhood. Every word made things worse. Because I already knew where those photos came from. My house. The house Dylan never owned. The house he'd spent years pretending was his. Darren pulled out his phone and started showing me pictures. There it was. My driveway. My garage. My backyard. My property. Being used as proof of somebody else's success. I felt sick. He told me he had major clients lined up, Darren continued. Said he needed money for equipment and software. Made it sound like a guaranteed investment. The more I listened, the uglier it became. Dylan hadn't just lied to family. He'd apparently built an entire fake image around my success. Using my property. My stability. My sacrifices. To convince strangers he was trustworthy. Darren shook his head. Everything sounded legitimate. I could see why. Dylan had always been good at talking. Reality was usually the problem. What happens if he doesn't pay you back? I asked. Darren's expression hardened. I've got contracts, copies of his ID, signed paperwork, messages, everything. He folded his arms. And if he doesn't pay? The look on his face said he'd already made up his mind. I'll see him in court. After the guy left my apartment, Marcus was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Your brother seriously borrowed money by pretending your life was his life? Apparently. That's not regular lying anymore, he said. That's commitment. I wanted to laugh too, but honestly I mostly felt exhausted. Every time I thought the situation had reached peak insanity, Dylan somehow found a way to make it worse. 2 days later I got a call from an unknown number. I answered and immediately recognized his voice. Theo. He sounded terrified. Not annoyed. Not arrogant. Terrified. There's this guy looking for me. Darren? Yeah. I leaned back in my chair. What about him? He's serious. I didn't respond. For once, I wanted him to sit in the silence. Theo, I need help. There it was. The emergency button again. The same thing my family always used whenever consequences finally showed up. I heard you borrowed money using my house. It's not exactly like that. Then explain it. He hesitated. And that hesitation told me everything. Eventually he admitted it. He'd shown people pictures of the property. Talked about living there. Talked about having successful clients. Talked about future contracts that didn't exist. Talked about money he wasn't making. All because it sounded better than the truth. You told people you were successful because of things I built? I said. I thought I could make it work. How? No answer. Dylan, you made almost nothing last year. I know. So what was the plan? Another silence. Finally. I figured something would happen. That sentence summed up his entire life. No plan. No responsibility. Just blind hope that reality would somehow fix itself. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. Can you help me out this one time? I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I genuinely couldn't believe he was asking. You borrowed money by pretending my success belonged to you. Theo. No. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. For years I had rescued people from consequences. This time I refused. When I hung up, I immediately called Uncle David. The second I explained what happened, he started laughing. Not surprised laughter. Vindicated laughter. I knew it, he said. Knew what? That kid's been pretending to be successful for years. Then his tone became serious. Theo, this stopped being family drama a long time ago. What do you mean? He committed fraud. And unfortunately, David was right. Over the next couple of months, everything started unraveling. Darren wasn't the only person Dylan had lied to. Not even close. As investigators started connecting the dots, more people came forward. Different stories. Same pattern. Promises. Fake success. Borrowed money. No repayment. The total amount ended up being much larger than anyone expected. And the evidence was overwhelming. Messages. Contracts. Photos. Loan agreements. Eventually, Dylan accepted a plea deal rather than drag everything through a lengthy court fight. The consequences were serious. Financial restitution. Probation. A permanent criminal record. And for the first time in his life, there was no parent, sibling, or relative who could make the problem disappear. Meanwhile, the rest of the family continued falling apart in their own ways. My parents bounced between relatives, temporary housing, and whatever arrangements they could find. The same relatives who had spent months criticizing me suddenly became a lot quieter once they experienced the reality of living with them. Funny how that works. The biggest surprise came from the house itself. After everything was finally over, Marcus moved in. Not because he needed a place. Because he wanted to rent it. Legitimately. Signed lease. Security deposit. Monthly rent paid on time. The first month he actually paid early. I remember staring at the payment notification thinking, so this is what a normal tenant looks like. He took care of the property. Handled small issues himself. Asked permission before making changes. Respected boundaries. Honestly, he treated the house better than my family ever had. Around that same time, life started improving in ways I hadn't expected. Work was going well. My finances finally recovered. And I got engaged to my girlfriend, Emily. A small wedding is planned for next year. Marcus will be my best man. Uncle David keeps joking that he deserves an invitation just for surviving the family drama. At our engagement dinner, he raised a glass and said something that stuck with me. You know what everybody gets wrong? What? They think this story is about revenge. I looked at him for a second. Isn't it? No. He shook his head. This is a story about consequences. The room went quiet. You gave them opportunity after opportunity, he continued. You saved their house. Covered their expenses. Offered them a lease. Gave them chances most people never would. Maybe he was right. Because if I'm honest, I never actually wanted to destroy my family. I wanted them to appreciate what I'd done. I wanted basic respect. I wanted them to act like adults. Instead, they chose denial, entitlement, and endless excuses. And eventually reality caught up with them. Today, the house is occupied by a tenant who actually values it. I'm financially stable for the first time in years. I'm building a future with someone I love. And for the first time in a long time, my life feels peaceful. Still, every now and then I wonder if I should have walked away sooner instead of spending years trying to save people who never wanted to save themselves. AITA for evicting my parents and brother after they locked me out of the house I bought to save them from foreclosure?